joining us from. So as you all heard, we wanted to do a bootcamp, and we are going to use 5 sessions to do this bootcamp for AWS certifications. And so today is the first one. And from here, we would move on to the other sessions. So I believe next week we can have the other session. And so I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Emmanuel Kumsin, and I work for MTN Ghana. So those of you in Ghana, you all know MTN. And my role is an enterprise solutions architect. Let me add a caveat that at my job, I don't do anything AWS. So people get surprised when I say that. Yeah, but that's it. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is that it should also motivate you to learn some of these technologies, whether you're working with them now or not. When I started learning about AWS, I wasn't using it in my company. It was just out of mere curiosity. And over time, I got interested, and now I use AWS for various projects. So you don't have to get an opportunity to use AWS or any other technology before you start using it, right? And now these things are at our fingertips, right? With internet, you can just access any cloud provider or any service. So if you are curious, then that should be enough to learn about these things. So you can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my LinkedIn profile. I'm also on Twitter. I'm not active there. I hope to be active on Twitter in the near future, but I'm not active on Twitter. That's my handle. You can follow me. Maybe the more followers I get, the more active I'll be. So that's my Twitter handle. And there's this quote I like so much. It says that if you want to go anywhere, you have to start from somewhere. So I assume that most of us here are new to the cloud, or just maybe have minimal experience, maybe 1 year, under 1 year, or you are just starting out. There may be a few people who have been introduced to the cloud for a while, but I'm tempted to think that most of the people that will be joining this session are relatively new to cloud, and especially AWS. So with that being said, we can move on. And today we'll be looking at 5 main key areas. We said that focus today is security. So in AWS, there are various domains, right? So there's security and then governance. There's compute. That's computers or workloads that can run your applications for you. There's databases, there's storage, there's networking. And these things are quite interconnected, right? So for instance, if you want to use a compute service or you want a server to run your application, you definitely need some networking to be able to access that application. You will need some storage for that workload. And then because you don't physically see your server, or your server is somewhere else, you have to make sure that other people do not have access to it. So that's where the security comes in. So they are a bit interconnected. We could go on and on with how they are interconnected. So you realize that, and then in the following weeks, when we look at compute or storage, we might still be talking about security. And when we look at compute, we may talk about networking. So that's how they are interrelated. But today our focus is on security. And so with security, we'll start with the shared responsibility model. And then from there, we move on to authentication. We move on to authentication and authorization. Okay, I think the person is muted. So we can move on. From there, we look at encryption. And then we look at some multi-account strategies and how you can manage your multi-accounts. So usually your companies will have many AWS accounts and then they want to centrally manage them. So we look at how you can do that. And then we look at other services related to security. So that's our agenda for today. And we hope to be done within 3 hours. So I don't expect to exhaust all the 3 hours, but we shouldn't cross the 3 hours. So that's something for us. That's also because you can't absorb so much in a very short time, right? So we need to make sure we are not stressing our brains or giving our brains a lot of pressure, right? So we have to take it easy. I'll pause here and then I would want to know maybe our experience with the cloud, right? Our experience with AWS services, especially. Maybe about 5 people, just to get some idea of the people I have here. So we have Ken Wood, who has raised his hand. You can go ahead and tell us your experience, whether you are new or you've been playing around with some of the services. And yeah, so Ken Wood, go ahead.
Okay, so good morning, colleagues. My name is Ken Wood, as you mentioned. I came across your post, I think, on LinkedIn, and then I decided to share it on other platforms to get my other friends also to join this meeting.
Okay.
But then what I realized was it is free, and I'm quite surprised. I want to know the motivation behind you giving us this insightful training for free in the first place.
Okay.
And then also, I am new in the cloud technology.
Okay.
I've had some basics of cloud computing, and then I've acquired some basic badges.
Okay.
But I
like
really
what?
want to.
Like what? Basic badges, like which one?
Okay, yeah, I have cloud intro from IBM.
Okay.
And then just recently I acquired the practitioner CCP.
Okay.
Yeah, that was I think 2 weeks ago.
Okay. Congratulations.
So, thank you. So I'm fighting so hard to try and get this associate, which is very, 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 very difficult. It is not an easy exercise. Yeah. So I'm happy you've done this, and then I encourage other people also to join and then get more insight. Thank you.
You are welcome. All right. So let's address Ken's questions. Then we'll move on to Nanayako. So I wanted to dodge some introduction. Realize I didn't really introduce myself, right? I wanted to silently go on with this session without introducing myself, but it looks like we have to go back based on Ken's questions. So Ken is surprised that we are doing this for free. First of all, this is organized by AWS Accra User Group. So AWS has communities. There are various communities. Communities are basically individuals who use a particular technology and are passionate about it. So they discuss it and organize events or request for new features or test new features when they are released and all that. So there are several communities, right? And the user groups are one of the communities in the AWS session, in the AWS area, right? So other technologies too, they have communities. So if you use Docker, you know that they have communities. If you use Kubernetes, you know that they have communities besides their open source projects. So you need people to collaborate on them. For AWS, you can organize a user group. It's a voluntary community, right? So you volunteer to lead a user group, and then you organize meetings and events and all that. So AWS Accra has been around for a while, and we've organized several events. So even this year, we organized a serverless workshop where we had people from AWS coming to talk to us about how to use AWS and all that. We also had some of the heroes. Heroes are people in the AWS communities who are known for one thing or the other. So you may have a hero that constantly shares updates about AWS. They don't work at AWS, but they are interested in AWS products. So they share content on them. They do tutorials, create videos, and all that for free. So those people they are nominated and awarded that title. So yes, for us, we are a community in, let's say, Ghana, Accra, where we organize AWS events like this one. Now, while we are doing this, we realize that a lot of people are interested in the cloud, or when they hear the cloud, they become curious. So what is it? You have a lot of IT people who have been doing things the traditional way, right? But now companies are adopting cloud technologies and all that. So when they see these things happening, then they're like, how can I learn the cloud and all that? There are lots of resources online, mostly paid. And in fact, most of them too are free. Some of them are paid. Even the paid ones are I won't say they are cheap, but they are not expensive, right? So for instance, for $35, you can get a subscription to learn cloud for a month. So every month you pay like $35, and then on a platform like A Cloud Guru and the others, and then you can learn some of these technologies. They give you sandbox environments and all that to play around and test or implement some of their services, right? So it's become cheap to learn some of these things. When you look at the right side of this presentation, you realize that certifications. I have AWS certifications. I have Kubernetes certifications, Docker certifications, project management professional, and among others. It so happens that I have 14 AWS certifications, right? Now there are about 12 active AWS certifications. So I have 14 of them. I think my last one was recently, I think last month. Yeah, just last month, I took one of the latest exams. So that took it to 14. And I mentioned earlier that at work, I don't learn about, at my primary job, I don't use AWS even. So this was out of sheer curiosity and all that. There are some people like who have the curiosity, but how to go about learning AWS is the problem. And that's why we have communities like the user groups to help them. It's voluntary. You get some support from AWS, like credits to experiment with the services and all that. But it's not a paid job or a paid role. It's highly voluntary. So Edwin is the founder, and then I'm also a co-leader with this community. And so we organize these events to teach people or get people to experiment with cloud technologies. And for me personally, why I'm doing this is to help other people to start their cloud journey. So maybe it might have been easy for me. I found my way to learn some of these things and pay for them and all that. But it's not everybody who has that opportunity. So personally doing this to reach out to people who are curious, they want to start learning about these things and they don't know how to. So this just to scratch the surface. And I'll mention that taking an AWS certification does not necessarily make you an expert, right? You realize that there are lots of things you don't know. I mean, every day they introduce new services here and there. So taking the certification does not necessarily mean that you know how to implement a well-architected workload, right? You can read about it and all that, but you have to do it to to prove that you know how to do it. And so, but then, with that being said, taking the certification is one of the ways you get to know about some of the AWS services. So there are some services you may never use in your organization because you never have a use case for it. But when you're taking the certification, based the requirements for that certification, you get to know that there's a service like this that can do this and that, or is used for this and that. So for instance, in our bootcamp today, we'll see some of the services. We may never use them, but then when you are doing a certification, it tells you that, oh, there's this service. In case you need to use, you have a use case like this, then you can use them. So it's one of the ways you can get introduced to how things are done in the cloud. But then from there, you have to work with it to know about it. It's not just about doing the certifications. That's just like the beginning. It's just the beginning. So I've spoken a lot on this. I believe I've addressed Daniel's concerns. Now, quickly to Nana call, you can. So Daniel is new to the cloud. Nana call, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm also quite new to the cloud. I've been studying a little about it since the start of the year.
Okay.
And using the official websites like Skill Builder and AWS Educate as well. So just last month, I wrote the CCP when there was a promotion to give 4,000 plus vouchers to Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
And I was able to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to study for the Architect Associate exam before it's revised on August 29th. That's just about a month. So when I saw this, I was so excited that it's come at just the right time to help.
Yeah.
To prepare for the exam.
Thanks very much for sharing this. That call. So with this, like you mentioned, the Solutions Architect Associate exam is changing in August. It's not a serious change, right? You can use your old knowledge to go and write the new one. It's just them rearranging the domains and the weightings for them. So it's not like a serious change. Also, the reason why they are changing the exam is because there are a lot of new services that need to be tested on the exam. So they are adding those services as well. And so if you are planning to write it and you've been studying for a while, I think you should quickly book it and write it before they change it. If you are new, don't write the old one. That's the little I'll say. Also, Ajiman. So we have two people who are quite new. Also, Ajiman, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, Emmanuel, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So, I am also, and I'm also new. I actually wrote my CCP 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
And I have been also, deliberating a lot. I'm actually planning on writing my CSA probably next month. But I feel sometimes, we concentrate a lot on, certification, and like you were saying. So when I see forums like this, for me, apart from the knowledge to learn, it's also, connecting with people so that because I'm new, I don't really know anything. So we can get, parts. When I connect with people like you who have experience, you can, guide us.
Hey, I'm laughing. Experience.
Yeah, so my career. But yeah, I saw 8 years of experience. That's a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's also a way of connecting, so we can get guidance on, how to progress in this career. Thank you for organizing it too.
You're welcome. So just so we are clear, I don't have 8 years of AWS experience. I have 4 years of AWS experience, 8 years of general IT architecture. Yeah. Okay. So that's about 3 people with the introduction. Any other? So maybe we can just start or continue with this. So one of the important things you have to know in cloud computing is the shared responsibility model. The reason being that traditionally, you would host your server, you see it physically, it's in your data center or data room, you have physical access to it, and it could be just in your network, your LAN, right? So there's no outbound access and all that. But now with the cloud, you are hosting your servers somewhere you don't know. You only know like the city it is in. Sometimes you don't even know where your server is, right? Or the service you are using, where the server is. So it means that you have to be, even in the traditional setting, you have to take security seriously. And how much more in the cloud where you don't control the physical access and the equipment itself, right? So the shared responsibility model basically tells the customer, or that's you, the person using the cloud service, what your responsibilities are. And then also what the responsibilities of the cloud provider are. So the shared responsibility model is not only limited to AWS, right? It applies to all the other cloud providers. So in summary, you say that the customer is responsible for security in the cloud, and then the provider is responsible for security of the cloud. What does this mean? If you have any questions, you can just raise up your hand. When I want to answer questions, I'll call you. So if you have a question, don't unmute, raise your hand, and then I'll call you. If you raise your hand and I'm not calling you, still keep raising your hand. I'll call you when I want to answer questions. Okay. So what does these 2 statements mean? Security in the cloud and security of the cloud. What it simply means is that the data that is entering the cloud, right? It's your responsibility, or who has access to your data is your responsibility. However, the provider is responsible for the physical infrastructure, security of the physical infrastructure, making sure the infrastructure they are providing you is secure. If they are giving you a managed service, they make sure it is secure. The software Okay, looks like my Zoom restarted. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, you can
Okay.
hear.
All right.
Yes.
So let me go back to the presentation then. Okay. So I believe you can see the presentation now. Yes. So the operating system you are using, who has access to your equipment or the instances you are using or the virtual machines you are using? Who has access to your resources? The networking, is data encrypted or not? All those things are your responsibility. Which users can use your services and all that. All those things are your responsibility. So you have to start with this understanding that you, even though the cloud is built to be inherently secure, you have some responsibilities on your own. And then the cloud responsibility, the cloud provider also has some responsibilities as well. So how do we map out these responsibilities, right? With this screen, you can see the traditional deployment, that's on-premise. where you have your own equipment and infrastructure and your own applications and all that, you see that everything in there is, the background there is blue, right? So it means that you are responsible for everything, whether it's your application code, the security of the whole infrastructure, the database, OS, virtualization. You are responsible for everything here. Now, when you move to infrastructure as a service, that's IaaS. I would explain what IaaS and PaaS and SaaS are. So IaaS means infrastructure as a service. It means that you are buying infrastructure or equipment you would have otherwise, or you are renting. Yes, the word is rent. You are renting an equipment you'd have otherwise bought and managed on your own. So when you start an EC2 instance, you are using an infrastructure as a service, because traditionally you have servers in your own data center or your home even, and then now you can create VMs out of it and use them. But now you are renting a VM that somebody owns. So that's an infrastructure as a service. And usually the physical equipment is what you are given. Now you are you'd have to make sure there's an operating system and that your application is on there, and then you handle security. And if you need a database as well, you do so. But then a platform as a service is somebody else giving you the underlying equipment as well as services that you would require. All you need to do is send your application. So for instance, in AWS, those of you who have used AWS for a while, you realize that there's a service called Elastic Beanstalk. If you have used it before, all you have to do is send a zip of your application code. And then now AWS will create instances and all that. But even that, the instances will be for you. Now, when you look at something like Lambda, right? It's serverless. Let's not worry about what serverless is for now. But Lambda, what do? All you do is enter your application code in there. And so that is platform as a service. You don't worry about the infrastructure. All you have to do is get your application in there, and then they'll run it for you. Now, software as a service. What is software as a service? So we use products, let's say Google Drive, right? I want to use a product that everybody knows. So Google Drive, usually you would need to have a software that can do backups or store your data for you. But then Google Drive is a software that stores or archives your information or data for you, right? So if you have pictures or iCloud even, you have pictures, videos, and all that, you can put it there, and then later come and retrieve it, download it, or even delete it. So with a service like Google Drive, all you have to do is maybe add your data, upload your data when you want. The application is already written. Those of you in the enterprise space, there are services like Jira, Salesforce. You don't have a physical, you don't know where the application is. You don't know where the server is. All you do is you log into a web browser and then use the application. So you use the Jira application or Salesforce. There are a lot of such services in the enterprise space. So for infrastructure as a service products, you are responsible for your code, your guest operating system, database, and then security. For platform as a service, you are responsible for only the application code. You have to make sure the application code is secure. You don't leak any credentials in there and all that. For SaaS, you don't do anything. The provider is responsible for everything. So what is common between the IaaS, PaaS, and the SaaS? You realize that the underlying server is common. How information is stored is common. Networking is common there, and then virtualization is common because they have to use virtualization so that they can support multiple customers at the same time, right? So yeah, but then when the offering changes, then that decides whether you bring your OS or somebody, they have to provide their OS, among other things. So that's a shared responsibility model. It's a very important concept because when you start using cloud products, you have to be aware of what you are responsible for, what you have to make sure is secured, and then you also have to know what your provider is responsible for, right? So now let's move on to identity and access management. That's one of the big topics in the cloud or even in AWS. It's a foundational concept. You need to understand it to be able to do anything in the cloud. If you want to take an AWS certification, you need to understand identity and access management. Every certification, irrespective of which certification it is, whether it's a security or a developer certification, you have to know something about IAM to be able to score high marks or pass or answer those questions, because you definitely see something about IAM, and it's quite broad as well. At this juncture, let me mention that who was the first person who spoke? He mentioned Ken Wood, I believe. He mentioned that solutions architect associate is quite difficult, right? And there's a lot of material to cover, right? So this bootcamp is to introduce you quickly to some of these concepts, but then you still have to use your other resources. I mentioned earlier that some sites provide courses and all that. We'll talk about them later. But you have to use other resources to get better understanding of this concept and even practice them as well. You can't just attend this and then say, I know IAM fully, and then you may, so you are ready to write the exam. No, this is to point you in the right directions, because these are the questions, you have questions from these areas. So I'm pointing you in the direction where you may be questioned, right? Okay, so let's move on with that. Now, one bit, two concepts that make up the identity and access management. You realize there's identity and then there's access management. Good. So there are two concepts here. One is authentication, and then the other is authorization. So the authentication bit is the identity we are referring to, and then the authorization is the access management. So now what's authentication? Authentication is just verifying that somebody is who they say they are, right? So right now, if I have a Gmail account, right? So if I want to access my Gmail account, I need to provide my email address and then my password. If I'm able to provide my email and password, then Google knows that it is me, Emmanuel Kumse. Even if there are 1,000 Emmanuel Kumses, once I provide my personal email address and my password associated with it, they know that it is me. So now they can go and proceed with what they have. So the first step of any form of access is authentication. You need to be verified. You need to say that it is you. It's like you are going somewhere and then they ask you for your ID. Or even when you are going to take your exam, right? When you are going to take your exam, for those of you who have taken cloud practitioner, if you went to a test center, they will ask you for your ID, just to make sure that you, the person standing there, the physical person, you look like the person on the ID. Secondly, your name on the ID, is it the one that's registered to take the exam? So that's authentication. And so there are different ways to do authentication. There are lots of them. I've just listed a few here. You could use username and password. I think that's common, or email and password. You use access keys. If you don't know access keys, I'm sure we'll see by the end of this session, we'll see some use of access keys. They're basically security keys you can use to access a service, right? Or you can use to prove that it is you. So it's not all. You actually use it to prove that it is you. If I say you can use to access, that means I'm talking about authentication. But no, they are different. Authorization, sorry. They are different things. So access keys you use to prove that it is you. There are some random details, right? You use to prove they are you. Certificates. So some of you know about SSL certificates and SSH certificates and all that. Usually you have a private key and then a public key and all that. And then depending on the type of authentication, you submit whichever key you need to. And then I think we are familiar with the one-time password, right? So for instance, you are logging into a site and then they send you a one-time password via SMS. And then you have to enter that one-time password in the site or application. So for instance, when you are registering for a WhatsApp account, now you enter your number. They have to prove that indeed it is you. So they send an OTP to the number you provided. Now, if you get that OTP and provide the details, they can verify that, yes, we sent this particular number, this OTP, and then they have provided it back to us. So indeed, it is them. If you enter a wrong OTP, they will not allow you to continue the registration. So one other concept with authentication is multi-factor authentication. So what this is that usually you use more than one method to prove that it is you, because it is possible. This would why do they do this? We do this to really confirm that it is that person. It is possible that you saved your username and password somewhere, and then somebody saw it. So because they saw it, they can now go to, let's say that if it was your Gmail account, they can now go to your Gmail account and provide the username and password. They will be authenticated because they provided the information that Google knows you by, right? But when you use multi-factor authentication, now they add another layer where, so with multi-factor authentication, you use at least two different authentication methods to prove that it is the same person. So at least two, it says multi, so it could be 3, it could be 4. So what's a typical use case? Let's say you try accessing your Google Mail or your Yahoo Mail, right? And then now you enter your password. Google will say, should they send an OTP to your number that is linked to your Gmail, or should they send the OTP to an email that is linked to the accounts you provided? And then you select whichever option it is. When you do that, now they send you, after you've already entered your password, so now they send you the OTP and then you can enter it in the Gmail. If you get the second factor wrong, you will not be allowed to access your account, even though you got the first username and password correct. So it increases the assurance that indeed it is you. Other use cases of multi-factor authentication is usually when you are connecting to VPNs and all that, they will let you enter your username and password, and then maybe you have an MFA device. These are usually apps on your phone. So there's Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. After you've provided your initial credentials, now they send you a notification on your phone, and then you approve it. So that's also another form of multi-factor. Let me check. Okay, looks like nobody has raised their hands. So we are doing well. Now, the second thing is the authorization. So after you have proved that it is you, what can you do? So you all realize that with most systems, you have like an administrator, you have a viewer, you have like someone who can create reports and all that. So those of you who have GitHub accounts, realize you can add people to your account and then give them roles like contributor or reviewer and those things. Yes. So those are usually permissions that would say that this person can do that. So after you have authenticated, the next process is usually authorization, where the system would say that, okay, this person has authenticated, meaning that they have proved that they are who they say they are. Now, what permissions do we have for them? What is our system saying they can do? So this is a very important concept in IAM and even every security system, right? You need permissions before, you should be given permissions before you can access something. And so there are two types of authorization. There's attributes-based access control. So authorization and access control, they are synonymous, we can say. And then, so there's attributes-based, and then there's resource-based. So IAM by default uses the resource-based. So what are these two things? The attributes-based would authorize you based on certain features of your account or your profile, right? So for instance, one simple way of implementing attributes-based. There are some sites that when you want to access, right, they ask you, are you 18 years? Like you have to confirm that you are 18 years. That is very simple. You just confirm that you are 18 years. If you say you are not 18 years, they don't allow you. So if you are registering for, let's say, Facebook, if your date of birth is less than maybe, if you are less than 13 or so, I'm not sure they allow you to create a Facebook account and all that. So you are granted access based on certain attributes of your account. You can do this in IAM, but it's not the default way of giving authorization or granting permissions to people. The resource-based is to give permissions to people based on what they have to do, right? So for instance, you can write, maybe if it's a blog, you can write a blog. If it's a blog, maybe you can read a blog or update a blog. These are resource-based. They are given on certain parameters, right? So that's like the default way of granting permissions. So we'll look, we'll go further into this later. So usually in AWS, you create an account. And then after you create an account, they give you what when you create an account, the email address you used is called the root account, right? After that, assuming that, let's say that account is for a company, most of us will have personal AWS accounts. Assuming that account is for a company, now we have to give different people in the company accesses, right? So maybe the systems administrator, the developers and all that, we have to give them access. So now you go and create them, those people, you create their accounts and all that, but they don't have access. Good. So you have to use this resource-based permissions to give them access to what they can do in your accounts. So that's like the basic concept for granting permissions to people. Moving on. What is IAM? IAM means Identity and Access Management. So it's one of the first services you get introduced to when you create an AWS account. And it's used for providing fine-grained access control to most AWS services. I would say all. There are a few things that do not necessarily use IAM permissions, but almost every other AWS resource needs some permissions before they can, you need to give people permissions before they can access them. So IAM does authentication and authorization. And the authentication bit is when, if let's say you are using a username and password to access the console, that's the authentication. So you create an account, maybe you give them a password or some access keys they use on the command line. When they use the username and password or the access keys, IAM says, okay, I know this person. So that's the authentication bit. Then authorization bit is now which policies have been given to this user. So if you have a policy to, let's say, create an S3 bucket, you can create an S3 bucket. But if you don't have a policy that says create S3 bucket, then now when you try creating an S3 bucket, you get an error, usually a 403 error, which says that you don't have access to perform whatever you are requesting. thing. So that's the authentication and authorization IAM does. That's like the general scenario. Now, how does IAM work really? So it's a service, right? It's a web service. When you try accessing your account, you interact with it without even knowing that you're interacting with it. You can also interact with it when you create users or you create roles. We'll look at what all those things are. So usually IAM would define the who. That's who has access to your account. That's the first thing. Let's not confuse this, okay? Who has access to your account? Simply who can log into your account. Let's look at it that way. Simply, yes. So you'd usually have IAM users there, or if you have SSO and all that, you can create an integration for such people. Now, what can they access? So these are the permissions you give them. So maybe company, which let's create a fictitious company ABC. They have maybe 2 IT people, a systems administrator and a developer. So let's say the systems administrator is the one who created the AWS account for the company, not on his behalf, for the company. Now he has to create an account for himself and create an account for the developer. Now, the first thing the systems administrator will do is he creates an account for himself and then gives himself he uses I mentioned earlier that when you use your email to create an account. So that's called the root account user. We'll talk about it later. But then the systems administrator has to create his own account. If his name is Emmanuel K, he creates an account by that name, and then he can access AWS with that. With the root account user, now he gives himself permissions to be an admin, and then he stops using the root account user, because we have to, security best practice, you have to use an account that identifies that this is you. You always have to make sure you're able to identify who is accessing. You don't share accounts between people. That's one thing you always have to make sure you don't share accounts between people. So you don't give one account. If I say account, I mean user account. So user. You don't give a user account to, maybe you create one user for the whole development team. No, everybody in the development team should have an account. So after he's created the users and then he's assigned the permissions. Now, when they try he assigns the permissions. Now, when he tries accessing or creating a resource, that permission is checked first of all. So you can see the correct mark or the wrong mark. So if you have a permission to, let's say, create a resource, you can create it. If you have a permission to read a resource, you can read it. Now, I see a question, I'll address it shortly. If you have a permission to read something, you can do that. So they are granular. You realize it says fine-grained. You state a permission for every activity. So this activity is called action. Yes, that's the technical name for it. So you have to create these permissions. Now, it's possible that you can just use a wildcard and then grant them all permissions on a certain resource or all permissions in their account. That's usually an administrator. And this is something we do a lot on our own. But in the corporate, that's in your personal account and all that. But it's not the right thing to do, especially when you are in a work environment or multiple people use the account. You have to give fine-grained access. So look at that. You give permissions on resources. So that's what they can do. Now, someone asked if policy equals permissions. So permissions are, or policies contain permissions. I think we'll look at that. So let me not spoil the fun. You can wait, and then we'll look at that later. So what are some of the features of IAM, Identity and Access Management? You can use IAM to give shared access to your AWS accounts. The company ABC we looked at, we had the sys administrator and then the developer. Now, even though an account was created for the company, both the developer and then the sys administrator had access to the account because users were created for them, or specific accounts were created for them that you can use to access that specific account. So if you say an AWS account, it is just a container where all your AWS resources are. Now, we'll explain further. I mean, let's build on top of it, okay? So we mentioned granular permission. So I said a granular permission could be to create an S3 bucket. It is a single action, create bucket. There's another action which will say put bucket policy, meaning that you can add a bucket, a policy to the bucket on who should have access and all that. You need to be given these permissions before you can perform such actions. Secure access for applications. So with IAM, we'll see this very shortly. With IAM, you don't need to create users for applications, right? It's something people do. They use access keys on their EC2 instances. Access keys are for people, but they would use access keys on their EC2 instances so they can access certain services if they've given themselves the permissions. But then with IAM, we will see that you can actually give applications access without necessarily creating user accounts for them. What the scenario I gave earlier means that if your EC2 is compromised and then somebody gets on it, they can use your account to do other things, right? Or the permissions for that user to do perform other activities. So it's not advised. We'll see why this is secured. We say secure access to applications later. Then there's ID federation. So ID is identity. Identity federation is simply people who do not have AWS accounts or AWS user accounts where they can go and that is created in IAM. But then you realize that in your company, you have, most people usually have Microsoft ADs. So you have an Microsoft Active Directory, and then you have an account that can be used. Assuming company ABC we looked at earlier had only two people, right? IT people or two employees, the developer and then the system administrator. But assuming you are in a company with 1,000 people or 10,000 people, you already have an Active Directory in place. If you move to AWS or you create an AWS, you go and create user accounts for all the 10,000 people. No, you can perform an integration with your Active Directory so that if you use your Active Directory account or your account on the Active Directory, you can use that to access AWS. So IAM gives you that feature. You don't have to come and create new users where maybe one employee will have an account for accessing AWS, and then when they want to log in into your company system, they use another account. No, this allows them to use just one account for everything, and they don't have to remember a new password and all that. There's also multi-factor authentication. I explained this earlier. IAM is integrated with like almost every AWS service, like 99.99%. Almost. So the default is to think that IAM is integrated with every service, but that's not true. There are a few things that do not use IAM. So that's one product in AWS you cannot do without. Okay, no questions. Let's move on. It's 11. We started. Let's take a break. Okay, let's take a break. And that will fry. So let's do this countdown timer. Let's take a 10 minutes break. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So this will be our timer. We'll come back when the timer runs down. So when it's 00, resume. Okay, so we have about 1 minute to resume. Then we continue from where we left off. So when it's 12:05, we take another 10 minutes break. 12:05, yeah. Take another 10 minutes break. Is everyone back? Or we didn't go anywhere?
Yes.
We didn't go.
Yes.
We didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, here.
Okay. So Daniel, do you know that when I saw your "we are tired" image, that's when I asked us to go for break.
Oh. I have to change it because I think most people are giving comments on this. I have to change it.
It's good. I mean,
It's like when I join a meeting and people. It's like when I join any meeting and people see we are tired. It's like, this boy cried. Does he want to leave the meeting or what?
Anyway, okay. So we can continue. Let me stop the timer. Okay. So we looked at the IAM features. We can now move on to the terms. So the reason why I thought I should put this here is that sometimes we confuse these terms, right? They are used interchangeably, but they mean different things. So everything related to IAM is an IAM resource. And at large, they are AWS resources. But for the context of this session, it's the IAM resources. So IAM resources will include users, groups, policies, roles, and then identity objects. And every other thing on the screen is a subset of the IAM resources. So identities. Identities are resources or IAM resources that you use to identify or group. So with that being said, it means that a policy is not an IAM resource. A policy is not an IAM identity. Remember I said the IAM resources is everything in IAM, and then identities are the objects or the IAM resources that you can use to identify a group. So you can use a user to identify somebody. You can use a group to identify somebody. People are in groups. You put users in groups, sorry. And then there are roles, because you assign a name to it, and then you state who should take on that role. We'll look at the definitions of all those items later. So identities you can use to identify a group. When it comes to entities, you realize that entities come from the word identities. So the only identity that is not an entity is group, because you cannot log in with a group, or you can't authenticate with a group. So that's the difference. When you see identity and entity, just remember that there's no group in a group is not an entity. Then a principal is a person or an application that will use an IAM resource to authenticate and access AWS resources. So I can be a principal if I log into the console right now, because I use my username and password to access AWS resources. So that's just the definition of those terms. We can now move on to what users are. So like I said, we would now look at exactly what users are. We would create a user and a group and all that very soon. But for now, so a user is basically an identity that a person can use, or technically an application can also use a user. But there are other ways to give applications permissions or better and secure ways to do that. So you typically create a user for someone you want to access your AWS resources. Of course, after creating the user, you have to give them the permissions so that they can use or access those resources. So a user would usually have a name and credentials. So their credentials could be their username and password, or the access keys you give them. They could also use some other credentials. AWS has a service called Code Commit. And Code Commit is like your GitHub, right? Those of you know GitHub. It's a shared repository web service, right? So you can host your Git repositories on Code Commit, just like you do on GitHub or GitLab. Now, when you want to access those repositories, you need an SSH key, just like you do for GitLab or GitHub. You need an SSH key. So those keys can also be created for a user, specifically for Code Commit. And then you could also create server certificates. So we mentioned earlier that you could use private keys or public keys. So usually the server you're trying to access will have a public key, and then you have your private key. And then when you try to connect, based on the public key, they will determine that indeed it is you. Yeah, so that's like what they call asymmetric encryption or authentication and all that. Yeah, but a user will need credentials. So these are various forms of credentials for users. And then of course, after you get your credentials, use your credentials to authenticate. We looked at what authentication is. So you need credentials to authenticate, but you require permissions to be authorized or to be able to access those resources. So if you have the credentials, but there are no permissions, then you can't use the resources you want to use. I spoke about the root account user. So now let's dive deep into the root account user. So that's the person that creates the AWS account. We'll not create an AWS account here. It's very easy to create. When you go to aws.amazon.com, you can go and create an account for yourself if you don't have one. All you need is, I think, your credit card, right? So that if you spin up any services that you need to pay, there's a free tier. So you can actually use it for free for the best part of 1 year. You have to know the limitations and the quotas for using it for free and all that. Yeah, so the email address you use when you are creating the AWS account becomes the root account. You specify a password with it. It's advised that you don't use it for your day-to-day activities, right? You create user accounts we discussed earlier, the normal IAM user account or the normal IAM user, so that it doesn't confuse you. You create an IAM user, then you can assign the permissions you want to. So definitely when you create the accounts, you need to log in with the root account user. After you do that, one of the first things you can do is to create user accounts or IAM users. If I say user accounts, I mean IAM users. So let's stick to IAM users. And then that's what you yourself or other people would use, right? Yeah, so you don't use the root account for your day-to-day activities. You don't also, it's advised I don't generate access keys because you're not going to use it for your day-to-day activities. You lock the credentials safely somewhere. You only use it when you have to. So since you use it for your day-to-day activities, there's no way to generate, there's no need to generate the access keys for those. It's advised that you configure MFA. It's good to configure MFA on all your accounts, even IAM users, so that someone will not impersonate you by getting one of your credentials. And then you have to use it for only tasks that a root account can perform. So there are some tasks only a root account can perform. So for instance, when I mentioned that if you are an administrator, you create a user account for yourself. You create a user account for yourself, and then you assign yourself the administrator permission. Now, assuming that the administrator mistakenly reduces his permissions, right? Then you need another person. That's if there's no other administrator. Then you can use the root account to restore those permissions. First, it looks like you're interacting with my screen. Can you stop? Yeah, okay. The other activities as well. You also, like when you want to delete your account, you need the root user. When you want to modify the settings on your account also, there are some settings you need the root account. So you don't use it for day-to-day activities like creating instances and the likes, no. So a group is a collection of users. I mentioned earlier that if you have a question, you can raise up your hand. So let's not forget that. I still don't see any hands, so I'll proceed. So a group is a collection of users. You can create as many groups as possible, and you can add users to as many groups as possible. You cannot next groups. By nesting groups, it means that you cannot create a group in a group, right? So groups stand alone, and but a user can belong to multiple groups. So you usually create groups based on the roles of people. Roles here, I mean what they do in the company, right? So for instance, the person is a systems administrator. You create a group for administrators. Usually you don't have only one administrator, you have a number of them. So you would put those users in the group. And then maybe you have architects. You also create a group for them. Developers, your QA people, you can create different groups for them. If you have an analyst who only creates reports or generates reports or analyzes certain things, then you can create another group for them. Now, why do we create groups? We create groups so that you can assign permissions to them. Now, when you assign a permission to a group, every user in the group gets that permission. So it's one of the easiest ways to assign resources to people. So now let's go to the console and then see all the things we've spoken about, right? So you realize that when I come here, the first thing that the flag here, say I should add MFA for myself, but then the root user has an MFA. So this is the right thing to do. That's why they've marked it. If the root user had not enabled MFA, it would also be there as a warning. It also says that your user, Bootcamp admin, does not have any active access keys that have been used for more than a year. Good. So that brings about, let me talk about the concept key rotation. So when you hear rotation, the word rotation, it means that you are changing your credentials. So for instance, if you have a database, you need a password to access it, right? It is advised that like regularly, like let's say on a monthly basis, you rotate the keys, meaning that you change the keys. So every month, your database password changes. Usually in an organization, you have password policies, right? So every month you may have to change your password. Changing your password is basically rotating your password. So these access keys, I created this account today, so definitely the access keys are less than a day old even. And so yeah, you don't use the same credentials for a very long time. No, if it's compromised, then other people can still have access to your account. or your resources. Good. So when you look up here, you see my user. This is an IAM user, Bootcamp admin at my account. So this is an admin account I created today. Why is it a Bootcamp admin? So we spoke about users and groups. Let's create a user, right? To create a user, you can use the console or you can use the CLI. There's an AWS CLI. Maybe we'll look at how to install it very soon. Okay, but let's use the console for now. So let me show you something before we even go here. You realize that in this account, you have a user here, Amplify. This user last accessed the console or AWS in 602 days. That's like almost 2 years, right? And last activity. So this is a warning. Like if the person is not using it, why is it still here? It is best to delete it, to delete the person's account, right? So that if their credentials are compromised, they will not have access to your resources. Because if the person really needs the account or needs access, they'll be using their account. And so these warnings are provided to you when you are not complying with some of the best practices. However, you see that this Bootcamp admin has only used, or last activity was 1 hour ago, and that's a green because yes, he's accessed the account recently, and then his active keys are 2 hours old. Okay, so now let's go and create our user. It's a very simple process. You only have to provide the user's name, and then you'll be able to. So let's create a user. What do we call him? Bootcamp user 1. So that's all you need. Now I have to tell us or tell AWS whether what type of credentials to create, right? So you have the access key and then you have the password. Access keys are used to interact with your AWS account on the command line or when you are using the SDKs. Or even when you want to interact directly with the AWS API, you need the access keys. So you say they are for programmatic access. Because it's like, that's where maybe an application or a script wants to access AWS, they need access keys. But if you're using a console, which is the UI here, then you need a password. So let's create the password and then the access keys for this user. Now, let's say that it should auto generate the password for us. You can also say that the password should be reset when they log in. For the sake of this demo, let's disable this, but it's the best thing to do because then the user sets their own password and you don't know their password again, and then they can use their own password to access AWS. Now let's go to permissions. So I've created the user. There are several ways to add permissions, right? But for now, let me not add a permission, right? So that we'll see what our user can do. Now, it is also advised to tag. Tag is a key value pair you attach to resources. So they are just labels. So that when you want to, let's say, audit your account or your environment, you know what a particular resource is for. So for instance, if I launch an EC2 instance without a tag, then I'll just see an instance ID. I may forget what it's about. So just imagine I have 1,000 EC2 instances. But when you use tags, they'll tell you that you can check the tags and you know that, oh, I created this account when I was doing the bootcamp. So I'll say, let's say bootcamp. And let's say I'll say true. So when I am auditing this account and I see this particular user, I see bootcamp true, means that I created, it occurs to me that, oh, I created it when I organized the bootcamp. So I'm giving a notice here that the user has no permissions, but I'll still go ahead and create the user. So these are my details. I can say they should send it to me in an email, or I can download it as a CSV. So now let me log out and then log in with our newly created user. Let's remember that our user has no credentials. Oh, sorry, has no permissions. So let's see what happens. Bootcamp user 1. Can you see my Excel opening? Daniel?
No.
Okay. So usually the Excel will contain the URL you should use to log in, and then the username and password if you enable the console access, and then they'll give you your access keys also if you enabled the access key. So this is my default user, but no, we created a new user, so let's use that user. And then this is the password. I'll enter the password here. Don't remember this account, so let me sign in. Okay, so now I see my console. This is the AWS console with all the services. Now let's try a service like VPC. It's okay if you don't know what a VPC is. It means virtual private cloud. So it's just an isolated environment. You can think of it as your data center in the cloud. We would talk about it more in the, I think, week 3 networking. So now I realize everything here is retry, right? It's just because I don't have access. So I can't see, even though I'm able to log into the console page, I don't have access. So I can't even see what resources I have there. If I go for a service like EC2 instance, so let's just
Emmanuel, change the region. It's also because of the region you are on. Go to Ireland.
Okay, so I'm in London now, and so let's say I go to another region. We'll talk about regions also in the networking session. Okay, so still I have nothing here because I don't have access to view this. Let me try another service. So this explains the concept of authentication and authorization. We say authentication is proving that you are who you say you are, and authorization is saying that what can you do? What can you do? So I get API error for this. I have access to even view the VMs or instances I have. So that's it's authorizing. I'm not authorized. I don't have permissions to see this. So yeah, that explains the concept. Now let me go back and log in with my admin account, and then we'll see the difference. So now Bootcamp admin here. The other user was Bootcamp user 1. Okay. Now let's go to EC2 again. You realize there was, we're getting errors when we went there. Now I'm using my other account. So let's check. Oh, first of all, let's just see I think it's better to see this one. Yeah. So now I can see values here. There's nothing like API error. I can see values. I can even click and then see I have one instance running, right? Because I have the permissions to do so. So that's the concept. Now let's go back to IAM and then give our Bootcamp user permissions, right? So there are different ways to give permissions to a user. You can, that's this guy. You can add them to a group, and then every permission you've given to the group would apply to that user. Or you can attach permissions directly to the user. The user can also assume a role, we'll look at that later. So over here, I have no permissions for this user. If I wanted to, I could add an inline policy. What that means is that so a question about policies have been asked already, which I have still not answered. Looks like I have to answer it here, even before we get to that session. So a policy basically contains permissions. We said IAM gives, or we can give users fine-grained permissions in IAM. So for instance, you can create a a policy which defines permissions for accessing an EC2 resource. So the permissions could be described the instance, and that's where it will show me the instances I have or the number of instances I have and all that. I could have a permission that says I should be able to read buckets or the contents of a bucket. It's granular, that's permission. But then the policy is a JSON document, basically, that will contain a set of permissions. And these permissions are also referred to as actions because they are what the user can do, right? So let's add the permission. I was talking about inline policy. So inline policy, you attach it directly to the user or the group, right? But there's another one called a managed policy. And the managed policy is reusable. So you can always go and pick that policy and attach it to an identity. So over here, when it comes to grant permissions, the first option I have is to add user to a group. Remember that we said if you add a user to a group, they get the permissions for that user. I could also say I should copy permissions from an existing user. So I can go to a certain user and copy their permissions and give to this particular user. I could also attach the existing policies. So these were the managed policies I was talking about. Now you see over here, they say AWS managed. I'll talk about this in the future, but since we're in the demo, let's do this, and then we'll get there, we can just go. So you see AWS managed here. It means that this is created and managed by AWS, right? They can update it if there's a new permission they need to add. But then there are also policies you can create yourself. And that's why I have this create policy. Now, when I create a policy, it's called a customer managed policy because I created it. I can also reuse it for another user. Next time I am creating a new user, I can attach this policy to that user. So in the past, we couldn't access EC2, right? So let's just give ourselves, to create a policy, you have to define the service, right? So which service should the identity access? So we say EC2, let's look for EC2. Now the actions are the granular permissions. So over here we have the access level. Access level is whether it's a list access level or it's read. So list basically would display the list of items. Read would get the information about a specific item. Tagging, we looked at tagging. So tagging will allow you to apply tags. Write will allow you to create or update that particular resource. So if I have write permissions, it means I can actually create an EC2 instance. So let's look at write and see if we'll find an action for that. So let's see. There are a lot of them, right? I told you there are a lot of them. So these are all permissions, granular to. So there are a lot of them here. Create image. So this is used to create an image. Create key pair. So even to create a key pair that you can use to connect to your EC2 instance is a permission. So let's see if we have. So these are the permissions, right? There are lots. For write alone, I could also say all EC2 actions. And then to select all the permissions from the other ones, okay? And you see it's giving me action warnings, right? Because this allows me to do everything in EC2, right? I could just remove this and then now come to the list permissions or select all the list permissions. So this will allow me to just view the items in EC2. So let's just use the list and read for this particular policy. If we want to apply a condition, so a condition could be, a condition should be met before the resource can be accessed. So, okay. But we'll not add a permission here. We could go ahead and then add additional permissions because remember we only selected EC2, right? We could go ahead and add S3, but I will not do that. So let's just go ahead and then she's even giving me warnings because some of the permissions are for like, okay, contains an error. So it means I have to just go back and then see what the error is. I think I can just finish this and then they'll tell me what the error is. Or better still, I'll just start all over again to avoid the error. Maybe I selected, let's see. Okay, good. So we said we wanted the lists and then the read. Okay, so now let's go ahead. Then next. Okay. Alternatively, I could just use a permission that already exists. I don't know why. Or it's also possible. So let me just give, let's say EC2 full access. We could also do, so you see EC2 full access here. You have EC2 read-only access. It's limited, so we can use the read-only. Okay, so let's use that. Okay. All right, so now let me add a tag. Always tag your resources. Then next, we have to give the policy a name. So let's call it Bootcamp read EC2 read access. You don't have to leave spaces. Then we'll give a description, which I won't. So let's create this. Realize that even though it says EC2 read, EC2 needs other services like CloudWatch and load balancer. So all those permissions are here. Let's create this. So now we have a policy. A policy contains permissions. That's the basic explanation for policies, right? We were going to attach permissions to our Bootcamp user one here. So right now, just refresh this one, and then let's see if we can find our Bootcamp policy. Bootcamp EC2 read access, right? So that's what we just created. We can just expand this, and then we'll see the service and then the accesses we give. It's the same one, okay? Now you see here that the type is customer managed. The previous ones we're seeing were AWS managed. So yes, I can select. You have to select it before you move on. And then I have to review this. Yes, so I'm giving this user EC2 read access. Now let's add the permissions. So we have now added permissions to this user. Now let's log out again and then go and log in as that user. Remember before we're getting API error for all the EC2 stuff. And we'll still get some API errors because we don't have the full permissions. We only give our user the read permissions. Okay. So let's get our password quickly. And then let's sign in. And then we go back to EC2. So let's go back to EC2. Now, at least one, something has appeared here before it wasn't so, right? So now we're able to read, check the user, Bootcamp user one. We're able to get all the information about the various services. Let's see our instances that are running. Okay, we can still see our demo instance. Let's try to launch an instance. What type of permission do you think launching an instance would require? Anyone can unmute and then answer. So next week we'll look at compute. So we'll look at EC2 extensively, right? Today is just a demo. So I don't need, this is just, I'm just trying to create. So I don't need all the other things. Anyone with the permissions you think we need to create the, and the key pair name, okay. So let's just select, sorry, I can say proceed without key pair, right?
Right.
Yeah, rights permissions. Okay, yeah. Well, I know that is true. But then you realize that it says I'm not authorized to perform this operation simply because I don't have the rights permission. So even though I gave the permissions to be able to view all the instances and the related services, I cannot add an instance here. So that's how the permissions work. Now let's change this, right? We can go and add our Bootcamp user one to the admin group. Now, when we add the Bootcamp user one to the admin group, we said that if you are part of a group, you get all the permissions the group has. So let's check that. Better still, we can create another group, right? So that we see the process of creating a group. So let's create another group. it's important to understand IAM, users, groups, policies, and then we'll come to roles. These are very important concepts. They apply in every aspect of AWS, so you can't use AWS without knowing these things. Now we have 3 groups already. Let's create another group. Bootcamp users. So let me just call it Bootcamp. Now, whilst creating a group, I can select the users I want to be part of the group. So Bootcamp user 1 is our target user. I want him to be part of the group. You can also go back later and then add other people to the group, right? So now let's use the EC2 full access. EC2 full access. Full access means that you can definitely write. Okay. This was remember I said policies, managed policies can be reused, right? So this is the policy we created. You realize you see I can select it even for the group, even though I created it when I was creating the other user. But it's still here because you can reuse policies if they are managed policies. Inline only apply to the specific objects, right? So let's go ahead and then assign the EC2 full access to our group. See here, create group. So we've created this group and then added our Bootcamp user 1 to the group. Okay, now we can log out. And then come back with our user with limited permissions. Now we should be able to create an EC2, I believe, because we have the right permissions. We are part of a group that has permissions to create an EC2 instance. So quickly, let's do this. EC2. So I can still see let's go back, right? I think it's important to say we can still see our resources, the numbers and all that. Now I can go ahead and then create another instance. This was the activity we were trying to do before. That didn't succeed. So let's call it Bootcamp instance. One thing about EC2 is that the name is also a tag, right? So the tag the name you are specifying here is actually a tag with the key name. With the key name, yes. So this instance, we don't need a key pair. Next week, we'll see what a key pair is. We can go ahead and launch this instance. Now I'm able to create this instance and it's successful because I have permissions to do it. That's because I'm attached to a group and the group has permissions. So now we have 2 instances running and this instance is called the Bootcamp instance, right? And when I go to tags, you see that the name is Bootcamp instance and that is what is showing on the instance. So let me pause here. Any questions? I think it's good to pause here and then see if there are any questions. If there's nothing or anything you didn't understand, if there's none, we can go back to our slide. It's almost 12. Okay, so let's quickly.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I have a question.
Go ahead, please. Who is talking?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It is okay. So I wanted to ask, can you create multiple users using it? But it would be hectic to create users one by one using the console. But can you do that with APIs just to create maybe 500 users at a go?
Who has tried this before? When I was creating the users, let me log out. So let me terminate the instance, okay? Because we don't need it for anything. So I can terminate it. I can terminate also because I have access to do that on this account, okay? So when I was creating the users, you realize I could add multiple users at the same time, right? Or it wasn't that obvious, but we can look at it now. So I could create multiple users at a time. Programmatically, there are APIs. So you can also write a Python program to create users. Maybe you have your usernames in a file, and then you can use the AWS APIs to create the users. I'm sure you can even use a bash script to do it, because when you have the AWS command line installed, you can write a bash script to create maybe a users from a file. So that's possible. But from the UI, you can do that also. So I want to show you that. The UI will be a bit hectic though, because you have to enter them one by one. So I'm now back to my admin account. The other account cannot create users, so I have to use my admin account. So let's go to users. And then, so if you want to create users, you need permissions to create the users. So you get the concept. Everything you want to do, you need permissions. Now, see here, I have add another user. So I can write their names here or the user names here. But that's one by one, right? And so it will take time. But you can use the API, or even with the CLI, you can create a bash script to pick the names from some file and then create an account for them, and then return their user accounts, or you even set it that the user should change their password, and among other things. Yeah, so that's possible. Any other question? If not, let's move on to roles. When we spoke about company ABC, right? We said we had a developer and then a sysadmin or a systems administrator. So the systems administrator would be like the AWS administrator, right? It's possible that a developer can also do or has acquired skills to be a systems administrator. So he has to do the things, or he can do some of the, we want to give him the access to do some of the things a systems administrator can do. Or the systems administrator is on leave, and whilst he's on leave, the developer will be the one performing the systems administrator function. What you can do is to give the developer access in the interim, right, to do that role or to perform that role of a systems administrator. The role I'm mentioning here is not the AWS role, it's just a function role. Yes, that one, what you do at work. Good. So, and then when the systems administrator is back, we take those permissions back, and then he's back to only working as a developer. You may have use cases like that. So a role is used to give permissions to people. We've already said that you attach permissions to people. So how do you do that? When you want to give them permissions temporarily, right? So it's it's like a temporal function they are going to perform. So let's say delegation. That's the initial scenario we looked at, where developer will work as a sysadmin for a while. So we delegate those permissions to them for the interim. So you can create a role with the required permissions and give it to the developer. And then with that, he can perform that activity. You would have instances where an AWS service will need to access another AWS service. So for instance, your application on EC2 may require access to read a file in an S3 bucket, right? And in that case, you need to give your EC2 instance a role to be able to perform the activity. So with that, you don't need the user credentials to get that access, or attach permissions to the user credentials and then give it, use the access keys on the instance. No. So roles are identities that give specific permissions, right? They are assumed when you need it. And then also, they don't have permanent credentials. So when you use role, you don't use like a username and password. It's meant for like programmatic access, right? And then to create a role, you need to specify the trust policy and then the permissions policy. So we looked at permissions policy. All the policies we've been looking at so far are permissions policies, right? But to use a role, you need a trust policy. What is a trust policy? A trust policy says that this particular person can use the role, right? Says that who can use it, because we are saying we are creating a role and giving permissions to it, but we can't log in with it. So how then do we say who can use it? It's by defining a trust policy. To say that, okay, Emmanuel can use the role, or EC2 can use the role, or another user in another account can use the role. So that's the trust policy. Permissions policy, it's what we've been looking at so far, right? So when do we need roles? When you need, usually companies will have multiple accounts, right? So maybe you have an IAM user in one account and they need to do something in another account. You don't have to create another user in the second account for them. You can just create a role that would establish a trust with the other account, and then your user can assume that role to access the resources in the other accounts. So that's how you do, you use multiple accounts. You don't create user accounts in each account for a user. Or if you are an auditor and then you go to another company, they don't need to create an account for you. If you have an AWS account already, you can create a role and then establish trust with your existing AWS account. So that's how that works. You can also use roles to provide IAM users. That's the one I just said, right? In another account. And then you can use it to give access to AWS services. Identity federation. So identity federation, I explained a little bit earlier, right? There's also a situation where, let's say you have an app and then people, let's say a game application on your phone, right? You usually log in with your Google account or Facebook. After you log in, they need to give you access, you need to update your profile, right? Now, assuming your profile information is stored in AWS, a service like DynamoDB, you need access to be actually able to write your name into that database called DynamoDB. You need permissions to do that. Now, they can't put, when they are working on the app or in the app, it is not good, or it's not a good practice to put the AWS credentials in the app. What happens when you have to revoke the credentials, when the credentials are leaked? So you don't do that, right? But you can use identity federation. So this will be web identity federation. It's like you're going to use a site and then they ask you to log in with Google or Facebook. The same concept, but just that here, when you log in with Google or Facebook, you define roles that when the person logs in with Google, allow him to. So typically, those will be very limited access, right? So they should be able to put their profile in the DynamoDB table, right? Or they should be able to download an image from your S3 bucket or add an image, something like that. So that's how you would grant access to those users on your phone. It's the same concept like you do when you want your employees to use their single sign-on. That's the example I used earlier. So this is web identity. That one is a SAML-based identity federation. Then now there's also a way to give your servers that are not in AWS access to your AWS account. So that's called IAM roles anywhere. It's quite new. It's one of the things IAM roles can do. Or when I spoke about service roles earlier, but I'm not in presentation mode. I spoke about roles earlier. We said that when you need a service to perform another action on another service. So for instance, EC2 instances need to send metrics to CloudWatch, right? So the EC2 instance would require some permissions to be able to do that. You not create a user for the EC2 instance, you create a role. But service roles usually, some of them are created automatically for you when you launch certain services, because without it, they can't function. So any role you create for a service is called a service role. There's a type where you create for your EC2 account to be able to access other services. Then there's a type where when you're creating a service, they create a role on your behalf. So for instance, RDS will need special permissions to talk to, let's say, EC2 or CloudWatch and the likes. So then for it to work well, so then it will need a service link role, and usually they'll create it themselves so that they'll be able to use those services or perform those activities. So we're in the console. Let's go back to the console. I think we can quickly look at that. Well, I said we'll take a break at 12:05 and it's 12:10. So let's take a break and then we'll be back at 12:20 to continue. It means we have 40 minutes after. When we come back, we have 40 minutes to close. So let's take the break now. It's important. It's not good to bombard you with too much information. Let's take it slowly. Okay, so let's take a break. We'll be back. If you have any question, when we come back from the break, you can ask the question. So we have about a minute to resume. Yeah. Okay, are we all back? Or are some of us back?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can continue. Okay, so all right, just before we proceed, I was going, just before we went on break, I was going to show you guys something. So you realize that there's a service here called AWS Service Role. So we are back. Yeah, we'll be closing at 1. So let's, when we'll try and get to where we'll get to. I don't rush anything. Wherever we get to when it's 1 o'clock, we stop. Okay. So there's a role here called AWS Service Role for Amazon EKS. And you see that as a service linked role over here. So this is a role that is created whenever you create the EKS service. That's the Elastic Kubernetes service. There are multiple ones for this one for EFS. They are all tagged as service linked roles. So that's what I was explaining. But then you have other roles that are just, they don't list the service linked role there. It's just a role. Let's see if there's any one I have created on my own. So you see I have EK assume role here, and it just says account. So it tells you what the trusted entity is, right? Who is supposed to use that role. So in such a case, this is the account. So it means that everybody in the account can use the role. But for this one, it's just EKS. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to show you before we went on a break. So quickly, let's proceed. Okay, so I spoke about Web Identity Federation earlier. You'd use that when you want to grant access to other users of your application. So these are end users of your application mostly. And it's advised that you use the Cognito service. So you can go and read more about the Cognito service. It allows you to manage external accounts. So usually people would create accounts on your applications, right? So they can use Google or Facebook to create their accounts. You could even accept unauthenticated people and then give them special permissions and all that. But with that being said, at the end of the day, you create a role for such people and then you link it to the ID Federation. So that's how it looks like. The same for what you do in a corporate environment, or if you want to use a SAML 2.0 ID Federation, you still need to create a role for it so they can access whichever resource you want them to access. Such a role, you not give admin rights because it is role specific, right? Or they don't need that. They're just maybe reading some small information in one service or updating something in another service. So just fine tune it. You can't use wildcards for such ones. Okay. So I believe we spoke, even before we got here, we spoke about permissions and policies. So permissions can be found in policies. So a policy is just a container for permissions. And in AWS, you will not attach permissions directly. It has to be in a policy. So that's that. We've looked at the identity-based policies already. So let's look at resource-based policy. So all the policies we've looked at so far, identity-based policy. However, you have a resource, you can state on the resource who should be able to access it. And that's when it becomes a resource-based policy. Because instead of the permissions now being attached to the user or the identity, you are now attaching it, or you are stating on the resource that this particular identity can perform this particular activity. So that one, resource policies are not attached to identities, but rather states which identities can access the resource. So it could be a list or a read or the same policies types we looked at. Then there's service control policies. So these are used when you're using a service called AWS organizations. I'm not sure we'll get to that today. It was part of the presentation today, but I will not get to it. So use SCPs, as they are called, service control policies, when you're using AWS organizations. What they do is that they limit the permissions for accounts in an organization. So an organization, AWS organization, that's the name of the service. What it does is it allows you to create multiple accounts. Remember earlier I said that in a company, you can't just use one account, or most companies will not just use one account. They may have multiple accounts, one for, let's say, production workloads, another for development, another for even maybe the finance team or the infrastructure team and all that. So organizations will help you to manage all these accounts as one, even though you log or you access resources in them separately, but they give you control. And then SCPs would allow you to limit the permissions or what can be done in that account. So a typical example would be that you have an account for, let's say, developers, right? When you use SCPs, you can say that the development account, they cannot maybe create RDS instance, not RDS, but Redshift. Redshift is for data lakes. Sorry, it's for business analytics and all that, right? And so you can create an SCP for that. And any user in that developer account, when they try to, they would not be allowed to. So SCPs will limit the permission. They don't necessarily grant permissions, right? You grant permissions from IAM in the user account, but use SCPs to limit those permissions if you are using AWS organizations. Then there are access control lists. So services like S3 and even VPCs have access control lists, right? They just say who can use those resources. And then permissions boundary, they're also similar to SCPs, but this time around they're applied to principals. Remember I said SCPs are applied to accounts, member accounts of an organization, but permissions boundary are applied to principals. So even if I have a policy attached to a user like Bootcamp user 1, that says they can create an RDS instance. RDS is the database service from AWS. So if I have a policy that says that, they can do that, right? And then I come and introduce a permissions boundary. A permissions boundary tells me the it puts limits, right? So permissions boundary can say that they should only be able to create EC2 instances and create S3 buckets, something like that. And then because of that, they will not be able to create the RDS because there's a boundary on what they can do. We've looked at identity-based policies a large already. And then we've spoken about resource-based policies. So this on your left is how an identity-based policy will look like. And then on your right is how a resource-based policy will look like. So we have three resources, right? Resource X, resource Y, resource Z. Now, these are identity. On your left, we have identity-based policies. As the name implies, they are attached to identities. So this identity-based policy says that John Smith can list read on resource X. And then the resource policy says that John Smith can also list and read. Now, what this means is that and then it also says what Mary Mayer can list and read. So with this, it means that on resource X, John Smith can read and list. Now, Carlos Salazar, he can list read on resource Y and Z. And then there's no resource policy on X for Carlos Salazar. So it means that Carlos Salazar cannot access resource X and cannot access resource X, yes. But then Carlos Salazar can access resource Y with this permissions, same as, so we'll come back. I was going to say, okay. So I was coming to say he could access resource Z, but I saw something different. So now you see resource Z has resource-based policies, but it says Carlos Salazar is denied. But then Carlos Salazar has an identity-based policy that says that he's allowed to read and list resource Z. So in such a case, IAM policies are evaluated such that they are all added together, right? But when you see a deny, it means that it is a deny. So in such a case, Carlos Salazar cannot access resource Z. Mary Mayer has access here. So even if there's no access here, she should still be able to, right? So yes, so Mary Mayer has access on all the resources here. And then Zhang Wei, no policy, but you can list and read from here, resource Y. So there's a question that says, what's the difference between resource policy and attaching a policy to a group? So when we started, you remember I started with some definitions, right? I said resource, IAM resource, IAM identity, IAM entity. So identity-based policies are attached to identities. We said that identities can be used to identify or group. So a user is an identity, a role is an identity, a group is an identity. So the group in IAM, you actually attach identity-based policies to them. But here's the case, and then a resource policy is a resource defining who can access it. So it's attached, I won't say it's attached to the resource, but it is part of the resource itself. So when you are trying to access the resource checks its resource-based policies as well as your identity-based policies. If there are permissions boundaries also in there, then that one would also take effect as such. So the difference is that you attach a group, you attach an identity-based policy to a group. But then with the concept of the resource policy, you could say, I don't want to confuse you, but I get where the question is coming from. Based on how, so to simplify it, just know that identity-based policies are attached to groups. and then resource policies are different. They are attached to specific resources, AWS resources, not IAM resources. Okay. They don't take precedence. They're evaluated the same, right? Or together. Let me put it that way. They grant permissions. So there's a caveat to it, though. A service like KMS, the resource-based policy must actually give IAM the permissions to grant identity-based policies. So for a service like KMS, yes, it specifically requires that to be done. But I think for every other service, they are evaluated together. So if the resource policy gives you access, then you can access. If identity-based policy gives you access, you can access. If resource-based policy says no, specifically says that no, this particular person or principal cannot be given access, then no matter what, you can get access. If an identity-based policy also says that you shouldn't be given access to something, then yes. We'll look at that shortly. Good. So there's the concept of the explicit deny, right? And then implicit deny. When you are giving permissions or when you are creating a policy, there is an element called effect, right? The effect is either allow or deny. So you can actually be given permission, allow permissions to access resource, but you can also explicitly say that a particular identity shouldn't be allowed. So that's when you choose the deny. So whenever there's a deny, automatically you are denied, irrespective of what another policy says. Maybe you may have permissions elsewhere for that particular resource, but once during the evaluation, one of the statements or policies said that you should be denied that resource, then irrespective of which other permissions they have for that resource, you won't have access. So that's called an explicit deny. Where you don't explicitly deny, so far we've not done any explicit deny in our demos. So there's an implicit deny. So it means that when we're trying to access the EC2 console earlier and then we're getting API error, we're implicitly being denied because we didn't say that that particular identity should have the access to that resource. But when we attach it to the group that had an allow statement, then now the implicit deny will not apply because there's an allow. So this the hierarchy. I'll share the slides. You can look at it. This is the flow. So when I share the slide, you can look at the various steps. But that's what I have explained to you, right? Then I mentioned earlier that you can be granted, a user can be in one account and be granted access via a role to access a resource in another account. So in such a case where the user is called the trusted account, and then where the resource is called the trusting account. Now, both accounts need to give this user access. How does that happen? So the trusting account, that's where the resource is, would create a rule that will say that the trusted account should assume that role. So that's where that trust is established. Now the trusted account will now have to create a rule, right? Or a permission that allows the user to access the trusting account. So that's where that comes in. So where there's a deny in any of them, then this will not work. But both must allow the flow. So yes. what are some of the IAM best practices? I've said before that when I showed you the console, right, you saw the MFA, the notice by the MFA, said the root account had MFA, but my personal account didn't have an MFA. So yes, we should require MFA for all of them. Where you have users existing already on some identity store, you should use federation. Don't come and create resources for them or create users for them, sorry, on IAM. You should use the federation, like the SAML federation or web identity, depending on the use case. So you use web identity mostly for apps, and then use the SAML for like corporate stuff or in an organization, right? That's usually the scenarios that apply. Then you can use roles to give access to people, because roles would retrieve what they call temporary credentials. Remember I said roles, you don't log into roles, or there are no credentials for roles, but there's a service called Secure Token Service, STS, that generates temporary tokens or credentials to be used to access resources by roles, right? So it's always better to create roles, because those credentials are short-lived. The credentials they get are short-lived, and when they expire, of course, they'll be renewed again. But it's also easy to revoke their credentials, even though they are temporary. Then we talked about rotation, where we change passwords often, so or credentials often. Then there's the principle of least privilege. If you didn't take anything from today's session, this is what you have to take. You only have to give people access to, only have to give access to what they need, right? So if the person would only be running an activity on an EC2 instance, you scope their permissions such that they only have access to that specific instance. You give only permissions required, not blanket permissions or everything you give to them. No, you have to limit access. This is because assuming an account is compromised, then and then you give least privileges. I mean, much cannot be done with it, because it's just, of course, some harm can be done, but you've limited your surface area, right? Or your blast radius, as it's called. Yeah, so it's good to always give these privileges. Still on IAM best practices, you should use the AWS managed policies. We saw them, and as you understand how people use services, you can scope these permissions to be least privileged, right? So in the console, we saw when last somebody used the service. Among other things, we could go deeper with Access Analyzer to see what they are doing. So Access Analyzer will let you know every activity or permissions they are using, right? So if you're giving access to somebody to RDS and they never use RDS, just take that permission off, so that it cannot be exploited in the future when it's compromised, the account is compromised, or the user account is compromised, right? And you have to audit. I'm reading a question. Okay. All right. So you have to audit your IAM resources, right? The console, we saw that I could see the last time somebody logged in and all that. So it's good to do that. Then you have to use SCPs. We spoke about SCPs and permissions boundaries. Both of them don't give permissions, but they limit permissions. So we have to note that. Yes, so the question is, when creating a rule, do you set an expiry date, or is there expiry set when somebody is made to assume the role? So by default, I think when you assume a role, the temporary credentials are for 12 hours. They expire after 12 hours. When it expires, it's renewed automatically. When it expires, it's renewed automatically. If you use a row to assume another row, then that one is limited to 1 hour. After the 1 hour, it is renewed again. So have you seen over here? Maximum session duration, 1 hour. However, when I come here, there's access advisor. I can see what it was used for and all that, but that's not why we are here. Let's look at revoke session. I can come and revoke all active sessions for that row and maybe perform an audit and delete the row if I have to. Once I delete the row, that person will not have access to it again, right? So there's no expiry date set, but you can, there's no expiry set, but you can revoke access or delete the row if you think it's not being used for what it was intended for. One other thing is that you can also remove the trust. So for instance, a scenario where the developer had to perform the duty of the sysadmin. When the sysadmin is back, you can remove that trust relationship that initially allowed the developer to use the role which gave him administrator access. Okay, so what's the time? Let's see if we can. It's 45. Should we pause for, we have a hard stop at 1. So should we do this demo or pause for questions and clarifications? So whilst we are deliberating, let's do this. I mentioned that you can, if you have a user in one account, you can create a rule for that user so that they can access resources in another account, right? Good. So I have my Edge browser open here. Can you see my Edge browser? My other browser with the IAM account or the IAM page. Do you see that? Hello?
No.
No,
I think it's just your slide.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's see. You see the other window now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. So I have another account here. Let's see. I have a user I can use for that account. Let's see. Okay. So this will be my trusted account. That's where the user is. And then the Bootcamp place will be my trusting account. They can be confusing, but it's better to take it slow and then keep pondering over the concepts. When you do, it becomes easier for you. But when you understand the concepts, then you can easily. Okay, so let's see. I have a user here. Let's see. So this guy. Let's see the permissions he has. First of all, power user access. Okay. So basically, you should be able to do a few things in our account. Let's log him as him first, then let's see what he's able to do. Okay. We have to verify what he's able to do first, right? So that we don't think there's any wrong access or they are using the existing access. That's the purpose of this activity. Okay, good. So now let me log in as the account. Then we confirm what it's able to do. So let's open S3, right? S3. He should be able to open our account S3 and based on the permissions we have and see the buckets we have there. He should be able to do that. Okay, yes, so we have two buckets here, and this is my account. Okay. Now let's log in as that's fine. We can come back to our Bootcamp account and then create a row. So what we want to do is the first account I was at, right? I want that account to access the S3 buckets in the Bootcamp account. So what I have to do is, first of all, I have to create a row in the trusting account. Now you have AWS service. So if I was going to create a row for EC2, I would have selected this one. There's also AWS account, and you see the web identity, and then there's a Samuel Federation. So I'll choose the AWS account, and then it could be this account. So when I use this account, what it means is I'm going to specify a specific user, or for every user in this account, they can assume this role. And you see here that it says select trusted account, trusted entity, right? So this is going to be your trust policy. Remember we said roles have trust policies and permissions policy. So quickly, let me get the account ID of this account, the account I want to trust. So that's the account ID. You could add an external ID where you pass a parameter to show which particular account it is and all that, or require MFA, but I won't do that. So quickly, let's move on. Now, this is the permissions policy. So let's say we want him to access our S3 buckets, right? S3, I have to enter before this thing would, yeah. So let's give S3 read only, at least so that we see the buckets, that's fine. And then next. So we call this Bootcamp assume row example. Now, this is how a trust policy looks like. You see something here called a principal. And the principal is who can, the person who can assume the account. When you are defining resource policies too, there's a principal. But when you are defining identity-based policies, there are no principals because the identity-based policies already is being attached to the principal. So you don't define that. Now we say S3 read only, right? So there it is. Yes, remember to tag everything Bootcamp. So this will be our review page. We can quickly go ahead and then, yeah, so it's been created, our rule is created. Remember we trusted the account, right? So now let's come here. We trusted everybody in the account too. Now it's up to our trusting account, our trusted account to limit those permissions. Let's see what happens. So now I think we should log in as our admin so we can create. We can create the other row, which will allow us to assume this. So let's say, Okay, so I am still. So now I need a row, but then hold on for me, okay? Okay. So can you still see my screen?
I mean,
Hey, your voice is
Yes, we can.
okay. So let's say that this user, right? Or let's say in my account here, I could specify this account. What's the name of the row we created? The name, we said Bootcamp. Let's search for Bootcamp here. So we say Bootcamp assume role example. But I have to search for this here. So let's look for this, the ARN. It's called the Amazon role name. So let's search for that. And I've copied it. Now this is the row. So let's say I want to switch row, right? Okay. So why can't I switch the row? There's a step I've intentionally left out. Is there anyone who can tell me? Let me check the chat. Anyone wants to attempt? Remember that over here, that's our trusted account, right? Where the resources. Over here, we said this particular account can assume this. But then when I try to switch rows from this account, it doesn't work. So what is wrong? Anyone? Well, I want to see if there's someone can answer this before we move on. Who's attempting? No.
Yeah, let me try. I think we mentioned
Who is trying?
Obed.
Okay, Obed, go ahead.
We mentioned that both the trusted account and the trusted account should grant access.
Good.
So
Good.
I'm thinking that right now we've done it for the other end, but we are yet to do it for this one.
Okay, good. So that's correct. Obed, do you plan to write any AWS certifications soon?
Yes, please, in August.
Okay. Have we given you a voucher for?
No, please.
Okay. So we'll give you a voucher, okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right. So now here we have what AWS service. Let me search for the service called STS. Hold on. Sorry. So this account here, so I create and we are creating our trusted policy or trust entity here, right? So we want people in this account, our account, to use this role. So now is this the other way around? In the first step, I created another another account, or I allowed access to another account. But now it's this account. So that's in the trusted accounts, you use the same account number. In the trusting accounts, you use the trusted accounts number. We have to get this that you would. So I think I already have a policy. Let's see. Assume rule. I'll just confirm if the account is the same. So let's see what it is. Okay. It's not. Okay, good. So I think UG, this should have that particular permission. Let's see. Let me show you. Leave. So now we are editing the policy. Good. So it's assigned to STS. That's the secure token service. It's a right. The resource is this. This exists already. I've created this already. But the question is it the same as the rule I created? Remember, this is Bootcamp cross account 173. Let's come here and see if it is the same. This is Bootcamp assume rule example. So it will not work, right? So what I can do is I can just change this. If you are doing it from scratch, you can create a new policy, right? But I just want to show an example of updating a policy. So over here, I can edit this and then just change the end here to Bootcamp assume rule. So it fits the correct ARN. Okay, so now let's save changes. And then review policy and then save changes. Now, to assume this role, we tried this already. So let's try it again. To assume this role, I have to come to my name here. And then you have what you call role history here. You can select a role you have here. When you use any role, it shows here, right? But this is not the one I want to use. So I can click on switch role. If I wanted to use that one, I could have clicked on it and then it will take me there. So the trusting account is this. The role is, let's see, Bootcamp assume role. I think that's it. Let's switch the role now and see. So it's just a role. Let me see what the role is. Yeah. Okay. So now I realize that I have moved from my account and check here. It says, Bootcamp assume role example at the trusting account. You have to get the names right. So, but then I'm in IAM and I don't have permissions because my role didn't list that permission, right? I don't. But then it listed S3 bucket. So let's go and search for S3 and see. Remember that before I only saw two buckets, right? In my own account, but now I'm checking the other accounts buckets. Now I have 9 here. I have 9. What's the total storage? It's 78.8 MB. Let me come to my trusting account and let's check S3 and see. S3. So I'm done with this. I'll explain another concept and then we can close on this. Yeah. So I'm in my trusting. You see it's also 78.8 and I have 9 buckets. And when I go to the other one, which is the assumed row, is the same thing. So now I use my row to go and get or view the S3 buckets the other account has. So that's one of the ways you can use rows. But what I wanted to touch on was this root thing. Let's go back. No, let's check the other accounts rather. So it should be here, IAM. But to do this, you need another AWS account, right? So to learn with this, maybe if you have a friend who is also practicing, you can do it together or create another account specifically for this. But yeah, so now let's look at our rows. This row, let's see. What did we call it? Bootcamp. Okay, good. So this is our trusting account. Let's look at the trust relationship. It says this account and then the roots. It means that every user in that account is allowed. Every user in our trusted account is allowed. That is how come I use my realized initially I was using another account, right? I was using something BC. But then when I was assuming the rule, I was using my administrator account. So if I want only administrator to access this, I think if I do this, how do I explain that? Okay, so let me change here and add what's the name of the other user? So let me edit this trust policy and then add the other username. I should find it somewhere here. This is not it. This is it, my BC user. Let me add that one and see what happens. Invalid policy for, okay, so let's do it this way. The simplest way to find the correct one is to switch back to my account. And then get the ARN of that user. So ARNs are used for references, right? It's not just in IAM. You may use them in other services also. And every resource has an ARN in AWS. So that's the Amazon resource name. It usually follows a certain format. So let's look at our users here. We are past our time. Let's quickly do this and close. So let me just check the user and find his ARN. Looking at a different user. Oh, I think I needed to bring user, but let me confirm this. I needed to bring user before the. Okay, good. So you see there's user here. Yeah, I could just copy it or just go and update and add user to it. User. And we are still using the administrator account, right? So now that we've updated this, let's see. the administrator should, this is the rule, Bootcamp assume rule. Yes, so now let's try again. Yes, it doesn't work because we were specific. And this is what fine grain means. Initially, we specified the whole account, but now we are specific to the user we want to access. So even though administrator is in my trusted account, because I removed the initial permission that allowed everybody in my account, which was root. Let me change this to root and let's see. Edit policy. When I change it to root, I think it should work. Because everybody, I could just also add the users, the administrator's ARN. So that it's just the administrator that can access this. So now that I've updated it to accept every user in the other account, let's switch role again. And it works. Yeah. So I guess that will bring us to today's, the end of today's session. Unfortunately for us, we're just like halfway through. There are a whole lot of other things to look at. So we wanted to look at encryption, which would basically be the KMS service. So KMS is used for encryption at rest. And then there's also another concept, encryption in transit. That's using HTTPS to encrypt your data whilst it's being transported. So when you are retrieving data from AWS, it's in transit. So you need HTTPS endpoints to access those data. So those two concepts are very important. But we couldn't look at that. And we would have done a demo of encrypting and decrypting data with KMS, but we didn't get there. They wanted to look at multi-account strategy. Remember I said companies usually have multiple accounts, but we didn't get there. I'll share these slides. So when we get the slides, we can see the other services. Like I said earlier, this is just to introduce you to the relevant concepts, and then that will help you in your preparation journey. So what I can also do is in the user group, I can share the resources you can use if you are preparing for any of the associate level certifications. And then we're also supposed to look at other services like CloudTrail, Guard Duty, Marcy, Spectre, Firewall, AWS config. Yeah. And next we could be looking at compute services. So that will be EC2 and the Lambdas and container service and Kubernetes. Okay, so there's a question which says, how do I join the user group? So that's the end of our session today. To answer the how do I join the user group question, you can go back to the meetup link we used for this event. And then at the bottom of it, there's a join Slack channel there. So I think that's the simplest way to join the user group. That's a join our Slack workspace. So I can just copy the link address and then put it in the chat for everybody who is not yet there. So I have just pasted that in the chat. When you click on it and you have Slack, if you don't have Slack, you can download it and then join our user group. So that's the end of today's session. Any questions before we close? So we'll meet the same time next week, but this time I will look at compute. So if you are preparing for the certification, this week you can focus on the security services. We couldn't do KMS and organizations and SCPs and the other services. The other services are also very important. You usually have questions that will have those as options. So maybe next week we can solve a few questions, right? Yeah. So they'll put all of them together. So you see a question, they ask you whether you use Marcy or Inspector or use Guard Duty or WAF, that's Web Application Firewall. And if you don't know what each service does, it becomes very difficult to answer those questions. You have to use the right tool for the right job. That's one of the themes of the certification. So any questions? If there are none, we can go. Any possibility to get an exam voucher? When you come and you ask questions, you get an exam voucher.
Yeah.
So if you want an exam voucher, ask a question or answer a question. And then I think we should make it when you answer a question. Like Enoch is getting an exam voucher. So yeah, for answering a question. So next week,
Okay.
when I come, I ask you 2 questions. When you answer, I give you a voucher.
Thank you.
Yeah. So answer a question and get a voucher.
But I think can we get that this PDF PPT as well, right?
Yes. So this video is recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel. When we post it on YouTube, we'll put the link in the Slack. So when
Okay.
you get to the YouTube channel, you subscribe so that the next time we post another video, you are notified. And then we'll share the PPT also in the Slack channel as well.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.